Thanks again for joining me. My name is Dante Dimatteo with the Ask Joe Dimatteo group. In this discussion, I wanted to cover a topic that I found fairly fascinating as it related to all things metabolism. But more specifically, we're going to focus on the model of constrained energy expenditure, which we will define here momentarily. So all of this stemmed from Dr. Herman Pontzer's recent book from March of 2021. It's called Burn. I have it sitting here in front of me. He's actually a professor of evolutionary anthropology and global health at Duke University. And in the book, he expands upon a study that, and many other things, that he had done with the Hadza tribe, who are based out of northern Tanzania. And they are actually one of the last remaining hunter-gatherer tribes in the entire world. So, as I mentioned, he focused mainly on metabolism. And his plan was to go there and shed light mainly on the current scope or the current picture that we live in with the whole obesity epidemic. And he wanted to try and pinpoint that, as we probably all would have expected, that their increased daily physical activity would therefore lead to higher daily energy expenditures, which allow them to maintain healthier body weights and therefore experience much less, if any, of anything related to obesity and cardiometabolic diseases. So to summarize his findings from his time spent with the Hadza, he had used doubly labeled water studies, which are basically just the gold standard method of tracking daily energy expenditure. We won't go too far into that, but that's what he had utilized to make sure he was getting the most accurate results as possible. He assumed, and like I assumed, and like many others would assume, that based on their higher levels of physical activity, that then they therefore would be burning and expending energy at a much higher rate than we would be in a more westernized civilization. So this way of thinking, more simply put, is just the factorial or additive model of energy expenditure, where the more that you do would automatically equal more expenditure, and it functions in a much more linear fashion. But as we'll see with his results, things turned out a bit differently. So adjusting for all factors, including lean body mass, which is very important when looking at metabolic rates, he found that on average, men and women of the Hadza community were not burning or expending more calories than men and women in, again, the more westernized cultures. So he looked at countries like the United States, England, Netherlands, Japan, etc. And so what he found on average is they were burning about 1,900 calories per day for women, 2,500 calories a day for men, which again, in a more aggregate data set, is pretty comparable to what we're burning over here today. And now this is just very hard to understand. Pontzer says it much more clearly than I can. And he basically just called this approach to the factorial model or the additive model that it's almost so intuitive and pervasive that it seems indisputable. So after even putting all this together, it's hard for me to still even kind of wrap my head around that concept. So this additive or factorial approach, Pontzer refers to it as almost so intuitive and pervasive that it seems indisputable. And I tend to agree, because it just feels like we've been told all along that the more we do, the more we burn, and we should expect, 1 + 1 to equal 2, essentially in this case. And we find that this whole picture is just much more nuanced. So what's even crazier is if we look specifically at the activity of the Hadza population, we see that individuals walk an average of 4 to 7 miles per day, and that's not even including the 1 to 2 hours a day that they're doing of more moderate or intense activities, including digging, climbing, building, those sorts of activities that are even much more demanding than the walking. So he even, I think, described it as the amount of activity that they get in a given day is the amount that you might see an average American get throughout the course of a week or a month or something along those lines, which is kind of hard to believe. But the point is, a few thousand years ago, this was the norm, and this is kind of how we were designed and how we have evolved, is to be able to handle this level of activity. So though we see that our energy expenditures are very similar, it still does not change the fact that exercise and movement and daily activity, it proves that those are just as important, and we'll see why for, a multitude of reasons. So in summary, Pontzer concisely stated that daily energy expenditure was not simply responding to differences in daily activity. Instead, the body seemed to be maintaining daily energy expenditure within some narrow window, regardless of lifestyle. So that puts a nice little bow on his findings from his time spent with the Hadza. So overall, what I want everyone to take home from this, and we'll break some of these points down a little further as we go. Number one, again, daily total energy expenditure is constrained. His research, along with the research of many others, have proven this. And so we must not expect exercise alone to be the main driver of weight loss if that's your given goal. So that's point number one. Point number two, just because exercise is not the primary driver of energy expenditure does not mean that exercise is any less important. In fact, you might even be able to argue that it's more important given this constrained model. It's just simply not the main driver behind somebody losing weight. So just remember that. And then number three, the day-to-day weight fluctuations that we're so accustomed to seeing when we hop on the scale, again, are not attributed to the changes in daily energy expenditure, but actually just more related to the natural changes in the amount of water that we retain for a multitude of reasons. So it's best that we not get frustrated or too excited when we see those day-to-day changes. So breaking down point one a little further, which is the model of constrained energy expenditure, we got to just run through some definitions. So what is energy expenditure? It sounds pretty self-explanatory. It's basically just the amount of calories or kilocalories that we burn on a daily basis. Now, when you break energy expenditure or total daily energy expenditure into its constituent parts, we see that there is basal metabolic rate, or BMR, which is just the energy that we require to essentially survive, or all that we would need to basically just be in a resting state for our entire lives. That's what that is reflective of. And that's our largest component of daily energy expenditure, where they've measured some individuals for that to make up upwards of 60% of expenditure. So the third piece of daily energy expenditure is the non-exercise activity thermogenesis, or NEAT, which many of you may have heard of. And so this encompasses anything that is like non-purposeful activity or exercise. So things like fidgeting, working at a standing desk, which I'm sure many of us are now, vacuuming, walking through a grocery store, all those sorts of activities that are not, purposeful activity or exercise. The fourth piece is then, as stated, since exercise is not a part of NEAT, then we do have the exercise activity thermogenesis, which makes up only about 5 to 10%, depending on how active you are. So when we look at the constrained model a little further, there is a caveat. Studies across various populations show that expenditures still will vary widely from individual to individual. Although many of these differences are specifically related to BMR, it's still worth noting that not every person burns the same amount of calories. There's genetic differences. There's a whole host of factors that play into it, but it's not coming from the bucket of generally exercise activity thermogenesis, but more from their BMR. Moving on, one caveat, one point I'd like to make with the constrained model is that individuals, so if you take two individuals who are the same body size, same body fat, they still might have different total daily energy expenditures. And so it's still important to note this inter-individual difference. But the point of what Poncer did was just to kind of look at this whole thing in aggregate, but we still need to see on the individual level that there are many other factors and genetic factors that will go into why, Jim burns 250 more calories a day than Joe would. So something to just kind of keep in the back of your mind throughout all of this. So again, as one were to theoretically increase physical activity, we would be expected to see the expenditure level off or plateau as we reach, higher and higher levels of activity. Those at moderate levels might still see an uptick in energy expenditure. So if you were to just start working out, you are going to see some changes. You are going to see some increases and some benefit. But again, as you adapt to this over time, you'll see that it doesn't then equate to, because I burned X amount of calories for 2 months, then I lost X amount of pounds. It's just, there's a lot more at play than just that simple fact. So I know you're probably wondering, what about all these people who are endurance athletes and runners? And my friend ran a half marathon and, he lost 15 pounds and so on and so forth. So because of that, we'll look at a study that Poncer brought up in his book, and it looks at individuals who were enrolled in a 1 year long half marathon training program. And so what we saw at the start of the trial, the athletes were, or novice trainees, however you want to refer to them, they were starting with 20 minutes a day of activity, so running in this case, and they were doing it 4 times a week. By the end, each of their runs were at least 60 minutes, and they were running upwards of 25 miles a week. And so any of you that have run a half marathon know that that's the volume of running that it requires. One step further in the study, women were burning 360 calories a day based on their body weight and mileage. And so the additive model, in this case, would have predicted that their daily energy expenditures would be just simply that much higher per day. But actually, by week 40, when they measured energy expenditure, this leveled off to about 120 calories. So you're probably wondering, like, where is this energy going? What is happening to these calories? And we'll start to unpack that a little further. But I mentioned what the women had experienced in the trial. The men had very similar results. Throughout the book, Ponser highlights similar studies to this one that looks at the half marathon athletes, but they all basically boil down to the same basic pattern. The longer the study lasts, the less that weight loss meets those expectations. And that's, again, reflective of this constrained model. So if we were to look at this a step further and just try to break down these ideas of what's occurring underneath the metabolic adaptation, we can look at an example of a calorie-restricted individual or somebody who's simply on a diet. We see that their total daily energy expenditures decrease as a feedback mechanism to prevent primary weight loss. And this is done primarily through the non-exercise activity thermogenesis. So what this manifests itself as is, it's not a massive component, but it plays a role. As we described what NEAT was prior, that's maybe less fidgeting, that's less activity outside the gym, that's more laying around, and all of these sorts of things, believe it or not, are kind of happening at a subconscious level. Now, there's more to it than just NEAT, but it must be noted that that plays a major role. Also, not only does energy expenditure decrease, but we see this complex feedback mechanism at play in our brain then lead to a paralleled increase in appetite. So it's essentially just a double whammy where you then, as a protective mechanism, are burning less. You are now hungrier, so you're eating more. And then the more weight somebody loses, the quicker the weight essentially comes back on. The longer that you're at that deficit, the easier it is to add that back in fat mass. And so seems like a bleak position to be, but it's simply just the reality for many individuals who have attempted this. Now, because of how complex this is, there are some efforts that you can take to mitigate these changes, though it's hard to approach them perfectly. But again, many experts will suggest that whenever you reduce your calories for a certain amount of time, let's just say you were at a calorie deficit, you've lost some weight, it's been about 6 to 8 weeks, there are these weight stabilization periods where for maybe 2 to 4 weeks or longer, you'll want to stay at that maintenance level of calories to help mitigate the changes that are happening in your, metabolic machinery. So that can help prevent that immediate weight regain. Also, adding calories back too quickly can often be a recipe for disaster. This, again, like I said, can lead itself to even preferentially adding fat mass versus muscle tissue. And so you'll see this even with bodybuilders who they were on stage, they came off stage, they went right back to how they were eating in the weeks and months prior, and even though these individuals were in great shape, many of them put on more fat mass than they had to begin with. And that's simply because of these protective, ancestral, evolutionary, however you want to call it, mechanisms that we have to serve and protect us. So the other part of this is if we look specifically at the obesogenic, quote unquote, environment that much of the research alludes to. Now, the obesogenic environment, as it sounds, is just the environment that is lending itself to us to maintain heavier body weights for a multitude of reasons. Ponser eloquently elaborated on this idea when he stated, "The foods that we eat overwhelm the normal checks and balances to moderate intake. It triggers the reward system in our brain. So it becomes more than just eating and finding nourishing foods. It becomes like, I hesitate to use the word addiction because I just don't think that highlights it appropriately. But the foods are referred to as hyper palatable or refined or processed, all those sort of buzzwords that I'm sure you've heard, they make it such that we crave these foods. We want them more. They're readily available. They're in our cupboards. They are cheap. They're in overabundance. And so this creates that obesogenic environment that doesn't give us a whole lot of hope, when we're looking at diet and lifestyle maintenance and, sustainable behavior change. And so this would theoretically be a topic for another time, but it's important to look at it through this lens in that most of the successful weight loss drugs that are being used today are not necessarily agents that are ramping up your energy expenditure. They're not necessarily increasing your metabolic rates. They're not doing those things. They're generally working at the level of the hypothalamus, the centers in our brain where cravings and such come from. So these reward pathways that we have now associated with these hyper palatable foods are now blunted whenever an individual starts a new medication. And so it just kind of changes the way I look at all of that. And it should change the way that you see obesity and weight loss and all of these sorts of things as a much more brain-centered issue that we're facing. Now, after hearing some of that, you might think that these weight loss efforts are completely hopeless unless you're on medication. And I don't find that to be the case either. We have to look at the flip side. So even though prolonged increases in physical activity do not lead to a sustained increase in energy expenditure, the research does show that even though those who move more end up eating more, that these higher levels of daily activity help to improve appetite and satiety signals over the long term. So it's more than just the sort of armchair engineer's view that Poncer describes the way we look at metabolism. You don't just exercise as a means to burn more and fit into your bikini better, which is what's been sold to us forever. You must understand that there are hormonal factors and signals at play that the more active you are, your body is better able to then match that with the appropriate intake. So it might seem like you're just eating more, but the give and take and the energy balance equation sorts to become more harmonious without you even realizing it, just by being a more active person. And now that might mean you go to the gym more or you run more or whatever, which is very important. But this is the more glaring thing to me here is that, yes, we need to do those things, but if we just simply try to do things like walking to work, making sure we walk around the grocery store, we take the steps when steps are available, all these cliche things that you hear, they're also important, again, because we don't have a similar lifestyle and we don't have a similar layout of living as the Hadza had, who were forced to hunt and gather and do tons of physical activity to survive, basically. So we have to kind of keep that in the back of our mind, as we consider what sort of lifestyle changes we can make, and not just in context of adding more time at the gym. In the inner workings of some of this, again, some of the machinery, we can see leptin and insulin functioning more normally, which then serve to suppress appetite between meals at a more normal interval. And so these are just huge reasons not to stray away from our ancestral levels of activity. We're just simply hardwired to move every single day. So on the back end of that, if we look at individuals with higher levels of adiposity and those participating in minimal levels of physical activity, we see that this group tends to have even further dysregulated appetite and greater trouble controlling satiety, which then kind of throws off the whole energy balance picture as it is. So in the most simple sense, the more you move, the more you can plan on your intake to match your expenditure. The less you move, the more hungry you're still likely going to be, which is not going to be conducive of maintaining a healthy weight or preventing excess weight from accumulating. So ultimately then, for weight loss, it is still best practice, as we recommended in the past, to try and meet or exceed these physical activity guidelines and then restrict calories in a thoughtful manner instead of doing so in such drastic measures. So I know that really kind of reduces this all down to a very simple point. That's not my goal, but it's just important to kind of, again, see some of the machinery and the inner workings of what's actually happening with our metabolism. So another sort of bonus point here, something important to look at, is the fact that, again, I didn't want this to be a discussion fully on weight loss, but there's something worth noting with this. The human tendency is simply for us to be very bad at tracking our intake or our consumption. So it's very easy for us, even if we are consciously trying to lose weight, we may not track the 15 berries that we pulled out of the fridge before we went to work. We may not track the added ketchup on the burger. We may not add the, believe it or not, as crazy as it sounds, the 8 pieces of gum that you chewed. All of these sorts of things do add up. Also accounting for the fact that not all food labels are perfectly accurate either. So we see that tracking our intake can sometimes lead to a recipe for disaster. So there is a bit of an art, a bit of a skill to tracking your intake a little more effectively. But the point is with all of this is that the New England Journal of Medicine actually did a study that estimated that upwards of 50% of people who said that they couldn't lose weight were actually underestimating the amount of food that they were taking in on a daily basis. So you hate to be whatever, you know what I mean? But I'm as guilty as anyone, and we make a ton of mistakes when tracking our intake. So I know that tracking is just, one small part of this, but it is important to know that it will sort of take a little bit of a heightened level of effort and energy just to try to make sure you're logging things as effectively as possible. Point number 2, I know we touched on exercise a little bit in point number 1, but we need to just drill this home that participating in regular exercise is still just as important as it was before the constrained model of energy expenditure was expanded upon. Poncer so eloquently says, in our modern industrialized world, free of the daily demands of foraging for our food, we need to exercise for our bodies to function properly. It's a legacy of our hunter-gatherer past. So again, we already did highlight some of these benefits of exercise on satiety and hormone regulation, but there's even more to this. Instead of viewing the model of constrained energy expenditure as an excuse not to exercise, it could actually be quite the opposite. We just have to see it through the lens that we're actually operating on a fixed energy budget. Exercise and physical activity do not change the number of calories burned over the long haul, but it changes the way that we spend them, and that makes the difference. So said again, exercise and physical activity do not change the number of calories burned over the long haul, but it changes the way that we spend them, and that's what makes the difference. So our bodies then adapt to our normal routines over time. So as we increase activity, the energy available for other metabolic processes ends up being decreased. And as we can see, everything is then a trade-off. Essential activities are protected, such as reproduction, and non-essential activities are reduced, such as an overactive immune system. Because of this, we see that exercise plays a huge role in lowering chronic inflammation. And we know that chronic inflammation plays a huge role in metabolic diseases, such as cardiovascular disease and diabetes. We also know that exercise, again, reduces stress. It can improve mood. It can reduce the symptoms of depression. We also know that more vigorous levels of activity and exercise help ultimately would keep our blood vessels, as Poncer puts it, as more open and elastic from a non-calorie burning perspective. It can help keep blood pressure under control and ultimately prevent the blockages and bursting that are responsible for the strokes and heart attacks that we so commonly see. Moderate levels of activity improve our ability to control our blood glucose levels by ensuring that glucose is making it out of the bloodstream and into the cells more efficiently. We know that it slows the rate of cognitive decline with aging. So the laundry list goes on, and it's not just from the perspective of got to burn more calories to maintain the weight that I desire to have. There is also a really important kind of summary on exercise's role on energy expenditure and even weight loss. So if we look at a study, the proof was kind of in the pudding here. Poncer cites a study of a group of Boston police officers who were split into 2 groups. There was a diet alone group, and then there was a diet plus exercise group. And this study just, again, is more evidence of the constrained model. We saw 0 significant difference between groups in terms of weight loss. So the diet group coupled with the exercise group didn't lose any more weight than just the diet group alone did. However, we saw that the diet plus exercise group were much more successful at maintaining the weight that they lost. So they were able to maintain that weight loss and sustain it for longer. And the main behavioral change at play was their heightened activity. So though it may not, knock your socks off in terms of the weight that you want to lose, it can certainly help you over the long term of losing weight or maintaining weight. And I don't know about you, the more and more I read this stuff or the more and more I hear about it, we're kind of playing the long game, and we're much less concerned with tomorrow in terms of our weight. We have to see the bigger picture. So bottom line, as we said before, just keep it moving. That's it. So point number 3, we do not want to give too much merit to these day-to-day fluctuations in body weight. We know that these acute changes are generally related to water retention, which in essence are related to the fluid that we are taking in on the day of or the day prior, our salt intake, our carbohydrate intake, how much stress we are under, and then also the hormonal sort of underplay with all of that. So for example, somebody who is in the luteal phase of the menstrual cycle might see different body weights just because of the amount of water that they're retaining versus being in a different part of their cycle. Understanding the constrained model just really helps us to see that caloric intake and weight changes from more of a bird's eye view are the way to play the long game. So how does water make this big of a difference? Basically, glycogen, which is the storage form of glucose, is stored with about 3 to 4 grams of water per 1 gram of glycogen. And our muscles are, at the level of the muscle, we're able to store upwards of 300 to 600 grams of glycogen, depending on the individual. So with that, if you do some quick math, you can see that your water fluctuation from a glycogen full state to a glycogen depleted state can range upwards of 7 to 8 pounds on a given day or two. So we just can't give too much merit to the day-to-day fluctuations in our weight. So this will, as to even kind of drive this home a little further, you've all heard of the individual who lost 10 pounds right off the bat when they started on the keto diet. And this is because they've decreased their carbohydrate intake. And with that, they have depleted the glycogen stores that their muscles were accustomed to having. And so then you see this drastic change in weight, you see this drastic change in water weight, in addition to them probably, exercising a little more. You see a much more stark decrease in weight right off the bat that you kind of got to take with a grain of salt. So given all of this, I still feel it's best to try and track your body weight daily or every other day, but then you'll have to back up a step and try to look at the trends from a week-to-week basis or a month-to-month basis instead of just a day-to-day basis. So in closing, I hope that you were all able to kind of take away my main points of this discussion. There's a million and one things in this book that I would have liked to cover. There's a million and one things about metabolism that I think would be beneficial to cover. But the crux of it is obviously that energy expenditure is constrained, and it plays a massive role in the obesogenic environment that we currently live in. And everything that we've been fed and told about weight loss challenges and obesity being a lack of willpower, we just know this from an evolutionary perspective, from an ancestral perspective, from a hormone perspective. We know this to be completely false, and that should be encouraging to you to continue to stick with the behavior changes that you're making, and know that there are going to be hiccups along the way with no matter what you're doing, and that again, we are in this to play the long game. Obviously life could be very short, but in essence, our ancestral mechanisms are in place for us to play the long game. It wants to keep our energy expenditure in a narrow window to kind of keep us stable through all the changes and through the changes in physical activity and the duress that we're under and such. So just know that, again, this is a very, very complex topic. I encourage you to dive in a little more. Come to us if you have some questions, but just keep playing the long game, and I think you'll end up being all right. Thank you. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this video, we would appreciate it very much if you would subscribe and hit the bell below. Thanks.